Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I am Stacy Blakely, Executive Director of the Policy Circle, and I'm delighted that so many of you around the country are joining us for our Move the Needle virtual experience focused on big tech. Now, we called this the Big Tech Tightrope because we really are looking at a conundrum in this country right now of balancing free speech, privacy, and innovation. The Policy Circle, many of you know, but I know we have a lot of new people on the call today, is a 501c3 nonpartisan grassroots organization. And we really seek to provide pathways and for women to become more courageous and informed citizens who take ownership of solutions in their community. And it's hard to believe that it's been almost a year since we sort of launched our COVID era Move the Needle programming. And since then, many of you have joined us. We've had over 50 programs, 65 speakers, and have covered a number of topics. But I really want to extend a thank you to our staff, our circle leaders, our state leadership council, and really all our supporters for standing with us and making our Move the Needle programming a great place to convene and learn over the last year. So we're going to continue to do this today. This is the first in a three-part series focused on various facets of free speech. So today, obviously, is Big Tech. Our next conversation in April is going to be looking at college campuses, tolerance, intolerance, free speech in that culture. And then the third will be tackling disinformation. Today, I want to give a big thank you to NetChoice, who is our presenting sponsor partner for this event. And thank you for supporting the Policy Circle mission. And I also want to thank DelBianco, who's also one of our partners for today's event, and all of our network collaborators. It's thanks to these collaborations that we're able to reach a much wider audience and bring more interesting, varied views to the conversation. So our goal today is to really shed light on the legal framework that governs free speech, specifically as it relates to big tech. We hear about this daily in the news. In fact, there's a vote today in Texas on a bill related to this issue. There are many of you who have maybe personally had a post censored, or maybe you've been taken off a social media platform. Some of you may have been upset about former President Trump being deplatformed. Some of you may have been happy about that. This is not unlike many issues in our country right now where we're really divided. But what I think is interesting is that there is a way, I think, and I think our speakers will shed a light on this, that we can come together and really understand what are the reforms that are being called for, and how can we as consumers and citizens hold tech accountable without violating free speech. And at the same time, we don't want to hamper innovation, but we want to respect people's rights. So many of you have participated in some polls that we sent out in advance, covering some of those as we kind of proceed through the conversation. But we've had some interesting poll results. And the basis for our conversation, just like any Move the Needle, is a Policy Circle brief. And so if you haven't had an opportunity, we'll be linking up our Policy Circle brief on free speech. And for those of you that have registered, we're actually going to have a Policy Circle virtual circle after this call to really dive into that brief and have, I think, what will be a robust conversation. But here's a video that I think sets the groundwork for our conversation today and provides a nice overview.
The free speech protections of the First Amendment are so complicated, it's no surprise that most Americans seem to misunderstand them. Free speech is anything but absolute. In fact, it only prevents the government from intruding on speech. The First Amendment gives a person no right whatsoever to say whatever they want on a private company's platform. Of course, all speech is subject to some regulation, whether or not it's on a private forum. You can't threaten people, you can't slander people, there are some limitations. But as much as social media companies like Facebook or Twitter feel like publicly available forums for anybody, they are anything but. These social media companies are privately owned. They're not owned by the government. So the First Amendment doesn't even apply to them. For example, a private bar or restaurant can kick out just about anybody for any reason, whether they're not wearing a shirt or they're too intoxicated. Now, the reason bars kick out drunk people is that drunk people are a liability for the bar. But social media companies don't even have that liability. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act says that they are not liable for what other people post on their forum. It would be like a bar that made a lot of money from drunk patrons buying drinks, but then had zero liability when those drunks turned around and attacked other innocent people. There is a developing philosophical debate that a social media company or an internet service provider may become so important to speech that they are a kind of public forum. In the future, there may be legislation saying that Facebook or Twitter or whatever comes after those things is a kind of public forum, and it may even be regulated by the government. Perhaps Section 230 will be replaced by laws that allow for liability for internet service providers or social media companies for what is said on their forum. First Amendment law is constantly evolving because the way we speak is constantly evolving, and the forum in which we speak evolves as well. It may seem unfair that a web hosting service would summarily dump a company's website because they don't like the company's speech. Whether it's Twitter permanently suspending President Trump or Simon & Schuster declining to do business with Josh Hawley, companies can't be forced by the government to put out speech that they don't want to put out there. In fact, even if a person is completely denied access to speaking on the internet, nothing prevents that person from opening their window and shouting out onto a crowded street. Ultimately, the First Amendment only limits government action. It gives a private person no right to say whatever they want in a private forum.
All right, well, I'm interested to get a reaction to that video and start our conversation off. Joining us today is Steve DelBianco. Steve is the president of NetChoice. He's the founder and president of Financial Dynamics, the policy chair for the business constituency at ICANN, featured editorials in Politico, National Journal, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, CNET, Chicago Tribune, and many more. If you've tuned into any hearings lately, any state legislature, you're probably going to see Steve on the screen. So let's give him a welcome today. And thank you, Steve. Happy to see you.
Hey, glad to be here, Stacy. Thanks for having us.
Well, of course, there's a great deal of rhetoric around this issue, and you and I have had an opportunity to discuss this in advance of today's call. But I think, we can see that there is sort of calls on both sides of the aisle, and there's pressure that you're getting from both parties and various constituencies. Can you kind of shed light on this debate and really how the First Amendment is a shield and not a sword?
Yeah, thanks, Stacy. And the mission of Policy Circle is exactly the right mission: to educate, to talk about informing rather than inflaming passions. And I think the video you ran just now helped to clarify this centuries-old approach we have in the United States to the First Amendment. And it was up on the screen briefly, but let me just read the first part of it. It says, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press." And think about when that was written and what it means today is that the government cannot force a newspaper or a social media platform to carry speech they don't want, or to force them to remove lawful speech that they do want to carry. And a lot of our viewers might think to themselves, well, wait a minute, the Federal Communications Commission seems to have some jurisdiction over broadcast television or radio. What's that about? Well, the spectrum, the airwaves for broadcast is a scarce resource. There's a limited amount of spectrum, and the government considers that since it's a scarce resource, it will allocate it through auctions and others, and it will regulate that scarce spectrum since it is the only way that people can communicate over the air. So that's the FCC and spectrum, but the internet, newspapers, nothing like that. Even cable television isn't even governed by the FCC. Now, toward the end of the video, there was this notion of whether there's a public square or a public forum angle. And so as for that argument, this notion that you could kick the First Amendment to the curb over social media platforms because they're the modern public square. But we actually have a fantastic ruling that's straight on point from less than a year ago in the Ninth Circuit. PragerU is a fabulous conservative video educational producer who has 1 billion views on YouTube, on their YouTube channel. And Prager, however, sued Google, the owner of YouTube, because 4 or 5% of Prager's videos are tagged as restricted mode.
Right.
They're still available, but under restricted mode, they won't show in my house because I've set my YouTube to not show restricted mode. And restricted is inappropriate for children. That's what that, giving parents the ability to control what shows in their home. Well, Prager sued, and the judge ruled very clearly that even though Prager said that YouTube was violating the First Amendment, the judge said, quote, despite YouTube's ubiquity and its role as a public-facing forum, it remains a private forum, not a public forum, that is subject to judicial scrutiny under the First Amendment. So it makes it clear the First Amendment protects social media platforms from Congress and from the state legislatures.
Well, and even with that holding, which I read that case that you referenced, because I noticed you referenced it during your hearing in Texas. Even with that very clear ruling, you've got, what, 24 states that have pending legislation. Like you said, I think you told me earlier, Texas is probably going to pass in the Senate today. But why do you think we're still seeing such a push at the state level, especially, to really go up against what's clearly articulated law right now?
Because as your video indicated in the beginning, very few people understand the First Amendment. They think it's a right that Americans carry with them every place they go, until they start to realize that a private restaurant, a private newspaper, or a social media platform is also enjoys First Amendment rights. So it's an educational process, the same mission that you have. I testified this morning in the Kansas legislature, and again, they completely misinterpreted the whole notion of the First Amendment. They get all tangled up about whether Section 230 is a factor, and it isn't. So these are states that are primarily Republican states. To be honest, they're all Republican states. And they're angry that they believe conservative content is not moderated in the same way that, say, progressive content is. And they're angry about the election. So the way of lashing out, about venting how they feel, is to be introducing these bills that would actually try to violate the First Amendment by requiring social media platforms to carry content they don't want to carry. Just last night, Stacey, the governor of Utah, Spencer Cox, exercised his very first veto of his administration, and he vetoed Utah's anti-bias bill, SB 228, last evening, claiming that it has significant concerns about constitutional violations. So we're going to have to fight those battles one at a time. If we don't succeed in the states, we'll have to work in the courts.
Well, you know, we joked, I think, in a conversation yesterday, how long does it take for 230 to come up? So you did mention it. And it is obviously something that comes up in all of these debates and conversations. And even the Texas law is trying to find a way to work around it, that bill in the Senate. Why don't you give us, if you don't mind, a little historical context? I was fascinated to learn that Section 230 was enacted 3 years before you could Google and 10 years before we could tweet. So those were not verbs at that point. So would love for you to give us a little bit of context about 230, and then we can explore a little bit about the reforms that are being proposed right now.
Sure, Stacey. It's true that all Americans love to share their own news and views on social media. We like to read and write, say, reviews of restaurants and travel experiences, product reviews on eBay and Amazon, and we want to be able to buy and sell things on our own. And we also like to be able to contribute and raise funds on things like GoFundMe and Kickstarter. Those are website platforms that enable content and commerce that's by and for the people, us. And those services exist solely because of Section 230. And why? Because in 1996, Congressman Chris Cox and Ron Wyden saw that America's lawsuit industry was going to pounce on these emerging new platforms over what users were saying and selling. And how did they know this would happen? Well, true story. The film Wolf of Wall Street is an actual origin story for 230. Mm-hmm. Stratton Oakmont, the brokerage firm, was a real boiler room operation using a pump and dump scheme for stocks. And a few of Leonardo DiCaprio's victims, they shared their war stories and woes by warning other people, and they posted them on an online forum called Prodigy back in 1995. Now, Stratton Oakmont sued Prodigy for defamation because they can't let people hear what crooks they are. And then a New York judge, believe it or not, found that Prodigy was liable as the publisher of those defamatory comments. Why? Because he said Prodigy did some moderation of the posts on Prodigy. So therefore, even if they moderate just to pull out profanity, nudity, and harassment, that makes them responsible for everything. Well, that bizarre result was read by Chris Cox in the Wall Street Journal in the morning flying back to Washington. And sure enough, before the plane landed, he had written the first part of Section 230. He said that the internet should give all of us a place to share our news and views. And at the time, broadcast television was only 3 networks. Cable channels were emerging. They served up their content. The radio was similar, and 1 or 2 newspapers controlled the news and views in each city. But the internet promised something different. A content creator becomes the broadcaster, and we are as numerous as the viewers. He also realized it was impossible for anyone to pre-screen all of the users' posts that go up, and even trying to censor the content would destroy that real-time interaction that we like on social media today. So they wrote the 26 words that created the internet. And those words are: no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of information provided by another person. The second thing Cox and Wyden did was they wanted to encourage platforms like Prodigy to do moderation of content that is legally allowed under the First Amendment, but it's awful content. Things like hate speech, pornography, scandalous lies, all of that's protected by the First Amendment. But how does he encourage Prodigy to take that down? So what he did was, how do you avoid that? How do you avoid lawsuit abuse for that? They wrote the second part of Section 230. It's known as the Good Samaritan Clause. And it says that no provider of an interactive computer service should be held liable on the account of good faith action taken to restrict material that the provider considers to be obscene, lewd, lascivious, filthy, excessively violent, harassing, or otherwise objectionable, whether or not the material is constitutionally protected. Now, that second part has only been used once or twice in court, since there really haven't been many lawsuits about removing content. Why? Well, let's recall our earlier discussion about the First Amendment, which allows newspapers and social media platforms to moderate however they see fit. So how would a lawsuit even succeed by trying to force them to keep up content they didn't want to carry?
Okay. Yeah, and I had noticed that there weren't many people hanging their hat on that second provision, and I guess that explains why, because it's a non sequitur there. So I think I'd love, just real quick, we've got another sort of minute together, and then we'll circle back up after we hear from our other 2 panelists. But what are tech companies doing to address this? I mean, obviously they want to get out ahead of these reforms and sort of present, like, here's our plan to deal with, you have conservatives who are very upset and they feel they've been unfairly targeted. And you've got these calls for reform. So can you just give me a brief sort of overview of what's being proposed for them to sort of self-govern on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, my advice for all of my members is, when you're in a hole, stop digging. Because every day there are more instances where the artificial intelligence algorithm or user complaint has resulted in a sort of a strange removal of content that to an ordinary eye doesn't seem as if it violates standards. So I realize that they've had to develop a lot of programs that analyze photographs, comments, and posts, and they're never going to get them all right. With millions of bits of content coming up on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, they're never going to catch it all and make the right decisions. So when mistakes are made, our companies, NetChoice members, are working harder at being transparent about the decisions and trying to be more accountable to enforce the standards the right way. Now, they can do that as part of their deal with us, the users, their audience, and advertisers, but the government cannot force any of that. There's some other ideas. Facebook has an oversight board now that is an interesting experiment where, after the fact, months after a takedown, they review whether it was proper. They've looked at several cases so far, and in almost all cases, they said Facebook acted too harshly on the removal, and the content's been reinstated.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And I'm really, this is a great segue for us to bring to the conversation Jillian York. So we'll come back to Steve here in a few minutes. Jillian is joining us from Berlin. She's a writer and an activist. She really examines the impact of technology on society, culture, values. She is the author. Her book came out yesterday, so we're congratulating her on that. She's the author of Silicon Values, The Future of Free Speech Under Surveillance Capitalism. She serves on the IFX Council, the Open Tech Fund Advisory Council, and the advisory board of SMEX. She's a fellow at the Center for Internet and Human Rights in Berlin, and a former English teacher in Morocco, and a travel writer. And she's joining us right now as part of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is also a partner with us today. So welcome, Jillian.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm very grateful to Steve for giving the whole legal overview so I don't have to dive into that.
You know what? I think it was a fantastic way for us to start. But man, as soon as he started talking about transparency and accountability, I said, let's get Jillian's take on this, right? So I think maybe it would be a great place for us to start. And you've done a really good job of this in several instances, but I think it was really a learning curve for me to understand what the tech stack is, right? So like this ecosystem of big tech. So if we're going to be talking about the tightrope, let's define big tech and kind of the players. So if you could do that for us, it'd be awesome.
Absolutely. Yeah, I really liked the way that you described the age of Section 230, that it came about before we had the verbs Google or tweet, because I think that is a really important element to look at in our evolving society. So the way that the tech stack works, think about it like this. It's kind of a stack of power. On one end of it, you've got platforms, which primarily host speech. That's mostly what we've been talking about so far. These platforms host what we'd call user-generated content, speech, videos, all of that stuff. And then at the far other end of it, you've got things like internet service providers, which play much more of a fundamental role in operating the internet. So we'd say that they're more core, or they're closer to kind of the center of the stack, the bottom of the stack. And then in between, you've got a whole bunch of other types of companies, cloud services. So, Google Drives, Google Doc would be kind of an example of something like that maybe plays a more fundamental role in your life or even in your business. Content delivery networks, that's companies like Cloudflare, and domain registrars, which allow you to register a domain name. And generally, the way that we think about this, again, from a philosophical and not a legal basis, is that the companies that play a more key role in operating the internet should maybe be treated a little bit differently than just those that host speech. And the reason for that is pretty simple. When we're talking about, your Facebooks or your Twitters, you do have a choice. I mean, yes, these platforms have become very big and unwieldy, but you can go somewhere else. But when it comes to an ISP, there are places all across the United States and throughout the world where people don't have alternatives. And so if you're kicked off from your internet service provider, you're kicked off the internet. And that's why I think it's really important to think of them differently. And from my perspective, that's where I think we're going to see the most important battles in the legal space in the coming years.
Okay, no, that's really interesting. And I think if we look at sort of deplatforming, help us understand, where does that happen in the tech stack?
It happens everywhere.
Okay.
So most of the stuff we see talked about these days is happening on Facebook and Twitter. And I do think there are concerns there, although I, of course, agree that companies should have the legal right to moderate speech, and they do in the United States. It gets trickier when you go outside, but outside the US, that is. But yeah, so when we're talking about deplatforming, you or I could violate the rules of Twitter or Facebook and get booted off the platform. And yes, I think there should be more accountability and more transparency around that, better appeals systems, but more or less, these companies are working to get there. And I'm sure Rebecca will talk more about that. But you've also got companies like Amazon Web Services, which recently famously kicked off Parler for violating their rules. And that wasn't the first time it had happened. They also kicked off WikiLeaks 10 years ago. So I think kind of no matter where you are politically, you might find an example of that you don't really agree with. And so I think that's an important consideration because, we might think, oh, Parler, well, they were just hosting all of this horrible stuff. And I'm not a big fan, I'll say that. But at the same time, if it can happen to Parler, it can happen to really any platform. And I think that's why it's so important to think about the tech stack as kind of a stack of power.
Really? Yeah, it is a stack of power. And I mean, ultimately, you think about content moderation is a form of power, right? You're a gatekeeper, which in these instances, these large companies, there's a tremendous amount of power in the gatekeeping and the amplification, which we'll talk about a little bit more. I'd love to get your take on really this concept, right, of content moderation and the concept versus what happens in practice. I mean, how can these companies, even if they're initiating efforts, right, and they're putting a tremendous amount of financial resources toward this? I mean, you have 3.5 billion users. So how can we get to a place where there is sort of trustworthy or consistent content moderation? Is that possible?
Yeah, I would say the fact is that we can't. And I think that this is probably where my views diverge most from Steve's, which is to say that content moderation at scale is just not possible. When these companies devised their policies and their content moderation procedures back in the early days, they were really thinking of a much smaller scale. And so they created a system of rules that made sense for them and their ideologies at the time. But as these companies grew larger and built their user bases all over the world, and I think it's really important to note that even Facebook, Americans are a minority on Facebook. And so, as they built these sort of really complicated sets of rules, content moderation became much more complex. They brought in automation, which has very high error rates and gets a lot of things wrong. Automation, I think it's really important to say, is good for some things. It's good for things that are classifiable on a binary, let's say, this box or that box, but they're not very good for things like text, which require a lot more nuance and kind of a human eye. And so I think that that's really the important thing to note, is that if we want to, it's great to support content moderation. I think there is stuff that we would all agree shouldn't be there, but we do need a revision of this, and we need companies to start looking back at their histories and saying, okay, maybe this rule doesn't make sense in the 21st century, and maybe we need to put more resources here.
So revisiting seems like it needs to be an almost constant process.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's really about process.
Okay. Well, and then your book that came out yesterday, which we see a picture behind you. That's so exciting. Congratulations. You talk about how companies like Facebook and Twitter really are unaccountable censors. And you use the phrase, obviously, on the cover, your tagline of surveillance capitalism. Can you give us a kind of an overview of what that phrase means and maybe how it applies to our conversation today?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to say that, I use the term censorship not in a legal sense. As Steve pointed out, this is not a violation of the First Amendment, but censorship traditionally didn't always come from the state. So right. Kind of just an important distinction. But when it comes to surveillance capitalism, I know that this term can be off-putting for some people because it has capitalism in it. It's controversial, but really what it is it's the output of, and this is defined by Shoshana Zuboff, who's a fantastic scholar. It's the output of unpaid users that she says is asserted as exhaust, waste without value, expropriated without resistance. And basically what she's saying is that, these companies are harvesting our personal data, our behavioral data, for their own profit. And so, the way that I've argued this is that they're not really there for the users. They're not there for you. They're not there for your speech. They're there to make a buck, and they're there to serve their shareholders. And that's a really important thing to note when we talk about free speech in these contexts.
Okay, that's very interesting. You're right. We're living in fascinating times when capitalism is suddenly a controversial word. So I think each week we have something new, right, that we have to navigate in these waters. But I think we're going to come back to you in a little bit, Jillian, because you really talk about in your book, and I know this is an assertion you've made for quite some time, really kind of having a user-powered movement, right, towards change. So we're going to come back and talk about that because I think that's a fantastic concept. And now I'd love to bring Rebecca MacKinnon into our Move the Needle chat. She's the founding director of Ranking Digital Rights, the author of Consent of the Network, which I love that phrase, the worldwide struggle for internet freedom. And from 98 to 2004, she served as CNN's bureau chief in Beijing and Tokyo. And she's the co-founder of the Citizen Media Network Global Voices and the founding member of the Global Network Initiative. Rebecca, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Stacy. And thanks to Steve for, again, doing the legal background. So Jillian and I don't have to. And congratulations to Jillian on the publication of your book, which I'm really looking forward to reading.
Well, and Rebecca, I think, you and I have had a chance to talk a little bit before now, and I thought it was really fun in conducting some due diligence that Jillian cited your work and really pointed to you being a pioneer in this space. And in 2011, you did a TED Talk, and you're looking like maybe I need to have you pick some lotto numbers, right? Because you really saw the future of what was coming a decade ago. And you've got almost 1 million views on that. And so I'd love for you to share with us kind of your take, right, on this whole debate that we're having right now as a country. One of the things you say is this isn't a content issue. that this is maybe about reach and not speech. So I'd love to kind of get you to explain that to the folks that are participating today.
Sure. Well, thanks, Stacey, again. And there's a lot there in those really two different questions. So maybe I'll talk about the first one first, about this TED Talk I gave back in 2011. And it's that TED Talk is sort of like, if you don't have patience to read my book, just watch the TED Talk, and that'll give you a lot of the basic points and concepts there. But if you remember 10 years ago, people were really utopian and optimistic about social media platforms and about the internet. Remember, we had the Arab Spring, and people were talking about the Facebook revolution.
Right.
Twitter revolution. You had activists saying things like, all you need to do if you want democracy in Egypt or wherever is just give people the internet and we will have democracy, right? People were talking about the internet kind of like freedom juice, right? You just kind of put enough into a system and things will become free eventually. And what this kind of way of thinking and talking about the internet really enabled tech companies to say, well, we can do whatever we want because we are a force for good because we are internet. In the long run, it'll all work out well. Let's not sweat the details. Stop complaining. You're not with the program. You're not modern. You're not hip, so on. And so I was pushing back against that, and in part because, as you mentioned, I started my career in Asia, in Beijing. And I was actually in Beijing when the internet showed up there.
Wow.
And everybody was like, oh, there's no way the Chinese Communist Party can survive the internet. Boy, were we wrong, right? But one of the things that I kind of saw maybe earlier than a lot of people because of my background is how authoritarian regimes adapt to the internet. And not only do they survive the internet because they learn how to use it, but they start changing the internet to suit their power. And they adapt. They put pressure on private companies to do their bidding. And so when I talked about sovereigns of cyberspace in my TED Talk, which is kind of the unaccountable internet companies. And the fact that they were unaccountable to sort of the public interest and human rights, but nobody elected the Sultan of Facebookistan. He's just kind of this Sultan of Facebookistan who decides what goes and what doesn't go. But what I was most worried about was when you put together government power with opaque and unaccountable corporate power, and that can result in a whole range of different human rights issues, not just potentially in our own country, but around the world. And not long after my book came out, we had the Snowden revelations of unaccountable NSA surveillance, lack of transparency by companies about their relationships with government, and so on. So that was one of the things that really motivated my my TED Talk at the time and my book. Was really about, and you mentioned this earlier, content moderation is power. And how do you hold power accountable when we're no longer defined so much by borders, when we're using these global platforms? And how do you actually protect rights and advocates for your interests in that kind of situation? And getting to your second question, right? You're saying my colleagues and I at Ranking Digital Rights, we put out a report last year called "It's Not the Content, It's the Business Model: Democracy's Challenge with Online Speech." And it's not that there aren't issues with online speech, but what we pointed out is, also referring to what Jillian spoke about with surveillance capitalism. The platforms aren't just this kind of public interest platform, right? They're there to maximize your attention on Facebook, in Facebook's case, so that advertisers will make money from you.
Mhm.
That's its purpose.
Right.
Right. All the other rhetoric aside, that is its actual purpose for existing. And so when Facebook is recommending content to you using algorithms that you don't understand, you don't know why you're getting this stuff, you have no control over how Facebook decides what to show you and what not to show you. And when you can be targeted by messages, including potentially disinformation or whatever, by paying customers, and an advertiser is a very loose phrase in social media, right? You know, and lots of all types of people can pay to boost content and target content on social media. If the way that works is completely opaque, how can you be free?
Right.
Right. And whether, you know, and all kinds of political actors are taking advantage of this targeted advertising business model to advance their political goals.
Right. It's
You know,
not
people of all parties.
The other. Everybody's using it, right?
Yeah.
Everybody.
The Democrats, Republicans, Russians, you know, Iranians, everybody, right? Yeah. And they're all in the mix, and it's all completely opaque and unaccountable about how we're being influenced. And so what we talked about in the report last year, and sort of we're also ranking now companies on how transparent they're being about these systems, is that companies, first of all, need to give users choice about the extent to which they're being targeted, how their data is being used to profile and track them. Mm-hmm. There needs to be a lot more choice. It needs to be a lot more visible. Abusive tracking and targeting needs to be regulated. So we're calling for privacy regulation rather than regulation of content, because as everybody's pointed out so far in this conversation, there is no consensus about where you draw the line between, you know, what should be taken off and what should stay up. We can't agree on it in the United States, and you certainly can't agree. There's no consensus around that globally either. Right. And what a lot of governments do, you know, we talked about this issue of holding platforms liable for what their users say. You have a lot of countries that pass laws saying, okay, platforms, any terrorist content on your platform, you are liable for, and we will define terrorism of any speech as any speech that disagrees with the ruling party.
That's right. Right. Yeah. I mean, we take for granted that's not what happens, right, in the United States. I think we take for granted how these platforms do work for us within the construct, right? And so, I mean, I'm interested, you know, the rankings that you guys, I encourage everyone on the call, we've got some links we're going to put up. Looking at these reports actually instilled a little bit of confidence for me. Like, I noticed that some of these people that are portrayed, or some of the companies, right, that are portrayed as like really bad actors, they actually were higher on your list in terms of taking action. And so I guess, you know, my question a little bit to you, and we'll come back around to this, is do you see that the tech companies are heading in the right direction, or do you feel like that there's going to have to be some level of government intervention on sort of algorithmic regulations or things of that nature? Do you think that tech companies can get out ahead of this, and especially given their business model?
Well, I think you are seeing companies recognize they do need to be proactive. Mm-hmm. I do also, I don't agree that there is no role for regulation, but I think there's smart regulation and dumb regulation. So not all regulation is the same. Mm-hmm. And regulation that focuses on transparency, that focuses on, you know, is the company actually conducting impact assessments about the extent to which its business in whatever way might be causing harm, just as, you know, with a lot of other types of businesses, you might require environmental impact assessments to make sure you're not polluting or poisoning people, or, you know, I mean, there's a reason we have labor regulations, food safety regulations, auto safety regulations, and there are similar reasons why you might want to have certain types of regulations, particularly around abusive data practices, making sure that companies are actually securing your data from theft in a responsible way. There's lots of different things.
Issues, right?
But the other point is that I think one of the things that our ranking shows is that when we start scoring companies, they start worrying about looking bad.
Yeah.
and that everybody out there has some power to push companies. As a user, you can start making decisions about how you do and do not want to use platforms based on how they're doing. We're helping to read the terms of service so you don't have to. But also, a lot of us have 401ks and retirement funds. Some of us might invest in stocks. Increasingly there are funds that are looking for whether the company is being responsible and on environmental and social and governance.
Right.
And so you can look for funds that are looking not only at is this company being good in terms of its labor practices or whether it's polluting the air or not, but also is this company respecting digital rights of users as well? Is it actually showing that the board of directors is exercising oversight?
Yeah, I mean, that's another really great factor, right? As we sort of consider, and this is actually, you've touched on something that we're going to almost wrap today up with, which is empowering us, right, as consumers and as participants in these platforms, right? Empowering us to understand the platform. And then even as an investor, I think that's another interesting way to look at how we can influence policy. So I think this is super interesting and I love your take on this. And so we're going to bring everybody together. So we've got Steve and Jillian back. Hi, guys. So we're going to do a little bit of a lightning round, and then we're going to take a few questions from our participants. And so, Jillian, I'm going to start with you. I want you to explain, and this probably piggybacks on what Rebecca was just talking about. What does a user-powered movement mean if we're going to start tackling this issue?
Absolutely. Well, so I'm certainly inspired by Rebecca's work on this idea. She said it first, and we've worked together many times over the years. But the way that I see it is, look, these platforms are at this point inherently global. They might be based in the U.S. and generally ruled by U.S. law, although European regulations and others do play a role in what we can do on them. But ultimately, the way that I see it is that at this point, with all of these millions, billions of people around the world impacted, it's really important that we hear what users say. And these platforms increasingly are excluding users from the discussion. And so what I want to see is not just the hand waving at diversity that we've seen from a lot of the big companies, but truly inclusion. And that means bringing people into the policymaking process, bringing them into dialogue around specific ideas and specific policies, and making sure that groups that are most impacted by certain rules are consulted about them. Just today, we saw a report in The Guardian about some really, really troubling rule sets that Facebook has put out in the Middle East and North Africa. I quickly tapped into my network, asked if anybody had been consulted, and not one civil society organization had. And so when it comes down to it, I think that we really need to rethink that entire process.
Okay, I think that's really interesting. Steve, I'd love for you to sort of respond to Jillian there about having more user participation and just your knowledge base on what these companies are doing to sort of tap into the consent of the network, which is, Rebecca's phrase. But I'd love to get your take on that.
Yeah, it's really a no-win situation. You characterize it as a tightrope, where I'm envisioning somebody who, if they maintain their balance, they don't fall into the abyss and the alligators. But the companies that are part of NetChoice aren't really on a tightrope. They have their head in a vice. Mm-hmm. And both sides, progressives and conservatives, are cranking that vice in opposite directions to put a squeeze on our head. So it's very much a react mode, and we react to governments that make mandates and impose liability for content that's put up by others. And those mandates caused the companies to make adjustments all around the world, because when you think about it, the First Amendment exists only in the United States. We only have principles based on freedom of expression in the rest of the world. And the worst element of American participation is called lawsuit abuse. Remember, in America, we don't have the English rule. The English rule is prevalent in courts around the world, where the loser of a lawsuit has to pay the other guy's costs. Not in America. In America, our culture is to sue. So the notion that lawsuits are going to solve things has got to be the lousiest path forward for innovation and user participation. But our companies are quick to hire outside groups to do things like fact checking, right? If they can do it quickly enough in real time. And you saw that Facebook created and funded a big advisory oversight board. Mm-hmm. But that is all after the fact, not in the moment. And when you're making decisions in the moment with let's say the context of what's happening right now, companies have to exercise significant discretion. They can't call it timeout because they need to make a decision whether to leave this post up in response to a complaint.
I understand. And the speed, and we've talked about this too, the speed, the sophistication, and something that can be posted today that's totally benign could actually be inflammatory based on violence in a particular community tomorrow, right? And so I think that speed makes this so challenging, Steve. And I think, if there is some measure of accountability, right? And obviously, as a recovering commercial litigator, I fully appreciate what you're saying about the legal world. But what is a path, right, of accountability? Let's say we're going to leave litigation to the side. What does that look like for companies? If there is, let's say data does support that they're taking down more of one particular type of post. I mean, obviously during the election, we had a ton of issues with disinformation, some things maybe being labeled as disinformation that turns out later on they were not. So that can really impact the outcome, for instance, of an election. So what is the solution that the tech companies propose in that regard?
Mark Zuckerberg is the CEO of Facebook, and he's testifying tomorrow in Congress at yet another hearing about disinformation. And I had a peek at his testimony, and he'll say once again that he thinks the answer is for Congress to make Section 230 liability protections contingent on a company making sure that they have a plan to take down unlawful content. So the word there is unlawful content.
Right.
To me, that completely dodges the hardest part of this whole content moderation equation. What about lawful content under the First Amendment, but awful content?
Right.
Because the First Amendment allows that other sharing. So those kind of proposals are of no benefit at all, because our First Amendment prevents the government from broadly prescribing a lot of content as illegal. It's still going to require discretion. So the ultimate choice has got to be competition amongst different business models, Rebecca, amongst different moderation regimes, Jillian, which is what you want to see. So that competition and innovation that occurs there is the right way to proceed. Think about Parler, MeWe, Gab, Rumble, all of those social media platforms instantly gained tens of millions of followers, and they did so by coming up with a different kind of a content moderation. They crank down a lot less strictly than do Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube.
Well, and it is that marketplace of ideas that I think we're all navigating. But I think it's interesting. We took a poll, and I don't want to throw a wrench in our program, but Maddie, who is facilitating our call, might be able to put some results up from this. But I think this is interesting, and I'll kind of want Rebecca to finish maybe commenting on this. But I know that we've got in some of these polls really a unanimous result on we don't think content moderation is fairly done. So I think really you almost had like 80 or 90% said it's the content moderation is not fair or consistent. And then though, I thought interestingly enough, most people said they did not know what their terms of service. So I think the next one was the terms of service. So they're either not reading it or they don't know what it says, right? I don't think that surprises anyone, right? That's also a rule as an attorney that no one ever reads anything. So let's be clear on that. But then I thought the outcome of the last poll was interesting to me, because really the question asked, should we be regulating these tech companies more? Specifically, should we be regulating how they conduct their content moderation? And I think we ended up somewhere, I'm guessing right now because I don't have the poll in front of me, it was like 60% said no, we shouldn't be regulating their private companies. So with that, Rebecca, I'm curious, this kind of final sort of question for you here, what does this consent of the network look like, given this framework, right? How do we move forward in a positive way?
Well, this is hard. We are at one of these points, not to get all abstract on you a little bit, but I will be, because there's just not going to be a simple solution and we're going to fix the internet like you fix your TV. And right. I think part of the problem is that we have people in Congress that think you just pass a law and you fix the thing. No. That's not going to happen. Just like you don't fix crime in Washington, D.C., right? Right? Because no matter what you do, somebody's going to feel their rights have been violated, or the law enforcement isn't tough enough, or okay, so we get tougher, so stop and frisk is a problem, right? So it's a constant negotiation about how you use power in the public interest, right? And you're never going to have agreement. And if you have no debate, that's probably because you've turned into North Korea. And if you have a perfect solution, it's because you're North Korea, right? And so we have to be able to live, I think, a little bit with the fact that, one of the reasons we really need free speech is that we're going to have to continue to argue about it and kind of, experiment with different approaches to making sure that power is held accountable in an appropriate way without violating rights. And so when I talked about consent of the networks, one of the reasons why I use that phrase is that, way back in the 1200s, in the 13th century, a bunch of nobles said, this whole thing about divine right of kings is really crap. And we're going to try and constrain the power of kings. And then it took until the 1700s before you actually implemented a model for how you actually implement consent of the governed in a physical space, in a nation with borders. And now we've got the internet, and power is exercised globally through commercial networks, is having impacts on all kinds of people, and people from across the world are having an impact on your freedom to vote potentially. And how do you hold that accountable? How do you kind of reorganize power and govern digital power in a way that makes sense, right? And it takes time. This is a fight that's going to continue for our lifetimes.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think there's something to be said, and in my individual conversations with all three of you, we have to get comfortable living in the tension with this a little bit, but do so in a way where we're educated about our choices. And I think that that's really our goal today, right, is to educate the folks participating. These are the choices we have, and these are the consequences of if we're rushing, right, and pushing policies through at that state level. What are these implications for all of us? And so I think it would be great if we could go to a few questions, if you guys are game for just a quick Q&A session. But this is really interesting. Melissa Hennessy asked, are there barriers to entry to create platforms? And this is kind of an interesting take, right? AT&T still owns all the telephone lines for landlines, and all others have to rent from them because it's too expensive to lay new ones. What are the barriers to creating a new platform? And I'd love maybe, Steve, if you want to start with that, and then Jillian, you can pipe in.
Thanks, Stacy. When it comes to setting up a platform, the internet has been probably the least number of barriers that we've seen in a variety of business models and technology models. Think about it. Parler needed only to hire Amazon to host their site. And within a few months, Parler had over 10 million people that joined. It's similar to Gab, Rumble, and MeWe. Now, the way they do that is that those influencers who join Parler would quickly go back to their Twitter account and tell everybody, follow me over to Parler. Now, the truth is most people didn't quit Twitter and join Parler. They joined both, and they got a chance to compare the different experiences there. The kind of content was there and the kind of moderation that was there. So we observed is there was very little barriers to starting, very little barriers to adding people, because people didn't have to switch. They just simply added. We also saw that network effects were not a barrier. Network effects would be, why would I join Parler if nobody I know is there? Well, that wasn't an effect that was in evidence. They had 10 million people within a few months. Now, a lot of you are thinking Parler, didn't they get taken down on January the 6th? Well, they did. Amazon said, you violated your contract with us. You're gone. And this has been going on for 11 or 12 weeks with Parler. Well, it took Parler a month and a half, but they're back. They found someone else to host their platform. And my Parler's working fine today. So there are very few barriers to entry, and it's very easy to acquire a following, but you've got to keep those audience happy and sometimes determine whether you're going to be funded by advertisers or you're going to have people pay, like the MeWe platform. You pay every month to join, and there's no advertising to support it.
Okay. And Jillian, what's your take on this in terms of barriers?
Sure. So, I mean, I agree with all of that, but I do want to hone in a little bit on the what happened with Amazon Web Services and the importance of the stack in this. Because if we look back a decade ago to the example of WikiLeaks, now not exactly a platform, but nevertheless a large site with a large following, they came up against a lot more barriers than Parler did because they had the U.S. government was against them. And so they had to go abroad to find places that would host them. They got kicked off not just by Amazon Web Services, but also by a domain name service, EveryDNS, and a number of other platforms as well. And so it kind of does depend on where you are politically, what kind of supporters and how many supporters you have, and how much money they have, frankly.
Yeah, well, and I think it is an interesting take, right? When you see someone amplifying on Twitter that they were moving to another platform, follow me. So they were not afraid to still use the platform, right? To channel people to their other one. So I think that's interesting. I would love to go to another question that we have, which this is really a pretty fantastic, I think, comment that we've got coming from Jamie Locke. No surprise, she's one of our Policy Circle superstars. So thanks for this question, Jamie. Even though the fairness doctrine has been repealed, many Americans receive their news from social media and news platforms and use social media to sort of spread the news. Would the fairness doctrine be a better avenue, which I think I already know some of your answers to this, versus, Section 230? I think there's interesting to see in the Republicans sort of killed that fairness doctrine and was against it. Now you've got some folks wanting to see that reemerge. I think maybe Rebecca and Steve, I can have you guys chime in on this. Rebecca, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I don't think the fairness doctrine is the way to go at all. I don't think you're shocked to hear me say that. No. I think there's a whole lot of reasons, kind of why we are where we are today, whatever you think about where we are today. And a lot of people get most of their news from social media, as was mentioned. But, the news organizations and the health of news organizations, the health of journalism is also another issue, right? Journalism is struggling. There's a whole conversation that's for another policy circle about the fact that most newspapers have gone out of business because they can't make any advertising revenue anymore because it's all gone onto social media. And then what do you do about it? And you've got to fight in some other countries like Australia, where the news organizations are saying, well, then therefore Facebook just has to pay us money so that journalism can survive. But so part of it is like, where's this information coming from that it gets, when it comes onto Facebook? Is it people just posting on Facebook what they saw down the street? Or is it coming from a news organization? Or is it coming from, some advocacy group? Or, where's this information coming from? And one of the things we don't have, in this country is a lot of the local news organizations that, once there used to be more of, have dried up. And so rather than the fairness doctrine, should we find some way for communities to fund more journalism in their own communities, so that you have people in your own community who are investigating the facts of situations and tying it to relevance to your life in your not only state but city or town. And so how do we fund that? How do we make sure that independent citizen journalism, has a voice and a place?
You're seeing a lot of that, right, Rebecca? There's a lot of journalists that are now turning to their own Substacks, or creating their own platforms where you can subscribe as an individual and support that type of journalism. And I think, again, this maybe speaks to something Steve said earlier, the ease with which, an individual now can step up and put something and contradict what's on the cover of the New York Times and have a pretty decent following to do that. So I love your take on kind of local and empowered journalism for that source of information. Steve, I'm going to kind of give you the last word here on sort of the fairness doctrine and what that really looks like for us moving forward.
Yeah, the fairness doctrine was only allowed to stand because a federal regulator had jurisdiction over broadcast airwaves. That's all that they could regulate. The fairness doctrine never even applied to cable TV, could never apply to newspapers or the internet. Mm-hmm. And by the way, it was repealed by Congress because it was a disaster. I mean, if the fairness doctrine means that each side gets equal time, what good is it if each side is fact-free and false?
Right.
That doesn't get us anywhere. And in fact, it ended up being unworkable, and Congress repealed it. President Reagan ditched it. It could never apply to the fora that we're discussing here today, places like the internet and online media.
Yeah, well, and there is so much to unpack. I could talk to you guys for like another hour, but our time is up, unfortunately. But I mean, this is such a fascinating conversation. I could geek out and we could cover all these doctrines together. But I think what is so useful is I think you've given us a lot to think about, really that comment about local journalism, right? And a user-powered movement. And then Steve, you really highlighted for us the power we have as individuals in this process. I hope that everybody that's on this call comes away. We like to say we want you to be curious and less furious, and more educated and less frustrated. And that's really the goal of the Policy Circle. So I hope we've accomplished that. I just want to thank the three of you for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. And guys, I just want to point you to a few quick facts before we wrap up. We have some other Move the Needles coming up. I think that Maddie's putting those on the screen for us. So mark your calendar. We're going to have April 22nd, we've got a Circle Leadership Series. Now, these are reserved for Circle leaders and donors to the Policy Circle. So if you haven't already invested in the Policy Circle, please do, because it's not only an opportunity to support our mission, but we're able to provide really remarkable programs that help you build your brand and your leadership skills. So that's coming up on April 22nd. There's a link on the screen if you'd like to participate with us. We're going to have another public sort of Move the Needle class dismissed. It's going to be about freedom of expression and higher education. You're not going to want to miss. We have incredible speakers for this. And whether you have kids in education system or you support your alma mater, you're going to want to talk with us on this day. And then April 28th, we have a virtual discussion around this freedom of expression and higher education. So again, I just want to thank our presenting sponsor, NetChoice, Debbie Ganaway. Thank you so much for your support, and for all of our partners. The Policy Circle, we're here to educate and empower, and we hope this has been a great use of your lunch hour today. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks.